May 1942, North Africa. British tank crews sprint toward their newly arrived American M3 Grant medium tanks as German Panzer units advance across the desert horizon. Within minutes, these crews will discover something their outdated Crusaders could never do: fire high-explosive rounds from a 75mm gun mounted in the hull. The Germans, accustomed to picking apart British armor with impunity, are about to face a nasty surprise. This single weapon innovation would help turn the tide at Gazala, and it represents just one chapter in the revolutionary transformation of armored warfare during World War II. From 1939 to 1945, armored vehicles evolved from lumbering steel boxes into sophisticated weapon systems that would define modern warfare. Tanks, armored cars, self-propelled guns, and amphibious assault vehicles, each designed with one goal: strike the enemy faster and harder than they could strike back. But designing these machines meant balancing three critical factors: mobility, firepower, and crew protection. Get the formula wrong, and thousands of men burn alive in steel coffins. Get it right, and you could turn defeat into victory and save entire nations from conquest. This is the story of how World War II became the proving ground for armored warfare, where engineering innovation met brutal combat reality, and where the victors weren't always those with the biggest guns, but those who learned fastest from their mistakes. The concept of the tank emerged from a desperate need to break the stalemate of trench warfare during World War I. Surprisingly, the idea found its strongest supporter not in the army, but in the British Admiralty, championed personally by Winston Churchill. He called it a landship. The word tank itself was deliberate deception, a cover name meant to confuse German intelligence into thinking Britain was building water reservoirs, not weapons of war. The rhomboidal shape of those first tanks, which lumbered onto the Somme battlefield in 1916, wasn't aesthetic choice, but engineering necessity. These machines had to cross trenches 8 feet deep and climb earthen banks 3 feet high. With crews of up to 12 men, these awkward behemoths carried 6-pounder guns and machine guns mounted in side sponsons, creeping forward at walking pace while bullets pinged off their armor. The French quickly grasped the tank's potential. By 1917, they fielded the Saint-Chamond, armed with a 75mm gun and 4 machine guns, built on the chassis of the Holt tractor, the world's first successful tracked vehicle design from South Africa. But the real breakthrough came with the Renault FT-17, the first tank in the modern sense of the word. It featured tracks, armor protection, and, critically, a fully rotating turret capable of 360-degree traverse. 3,000 were built, and roughly half remained in service with French tank units on the eve of World War II. How did this 7-ton relic, operated by a 2-man crew and crawling at 5 miles per hour, with either a 37mm gun or an 8mm machine gun, influence the coming conflict? The answer lies in what happened next. During the interwar period, France developed the light tank concept further. By the 1930s, Renault and Hotchkiss produced nearly identical tanks, weighing 10 to 12 tons, the H-35, H-39, and R-35. These machines mounted 37mm guns and bow machine guns, representing France's commitment to defensive doctrine. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain pursued a radically different philosophy. The British fell in love with tankettes, machine gun-armed tracked vehicles. The concept seemed brilliant on paper: a 3-ton tracked machine, fast and armed with a water-cooled machine gun, would provide armies with both firepower and mobility at minimal cost. The developing company, Carden Lloyd, was quickly overtaken by Vickers, which built an entire series of light tanks on reinforced chassis. Early models featured 4 road wheels on leaf spring suspension, operated by 2-man crews and powered by Ford Model T engines. The design incorporated standard automobile components to reduce costs. One variant could actually swim, propelled by a screw and steered by twin rudders, history's first amphibious tank. Another modification mounted a 2-pounder gun instead of the standard machine gun. Yet another bristled with 4 machine guns for anti-aircraft defense. As engines and suspension systems improved, the Vickers light tank reached speeds of 30 miles per hour, considered exceptional for the era. But could these machines actually fight a modern war? The most famous machine from this series was the Bren Carrier, developed from a light artillery tractor. After the Bren became the British Army's standard light machine gun in 1938, an improved hull was designed for better crew protection. This machine was meant to replace the cavalry horse. Pre-war exercises resembled Waterloo-era cavalry charges, just with engines instead of hooves. From the very start of World War II, this concept collapsed. The armor provided protection only against small arms fire. The lack of overhead cover proved a fatal flaw. However, the Bren Carrier could carry 6 additional infantrymen, transforming it into an armored personnel carrier, operating alongside tanks, providing protection against anti-tank teams. Bren Carriers could also mount flamethrowers, with the nozzle positioned above the machine gun nest, connected by hose to a reservoir containing napalm-type fuel. Compressed air shot flames every second out to roughly 50 meters. War quickly revealed the necessity of tanks working together with infantry. They depended on each other. Tanks fought enemy tanks while infantry broke through and seized territory. Though all Vickers tanks had weak armor and machine gun armament that couldn't stand against heavier German tanks and anti-tank weapons when supported by infantry and armored carriers. They performed excellently in reconnaissance roles, especially in North Africa's western desert. Another tank that distinguished itself with the 7th Royal Tank Regiment in North Africa was the Matilda, designed for infantry support. With armor exceeding 75 millimeters thickness, the Matilda remained invulnerable even to the standard German 37mm anti-tank gun. Sometimes it withstood fire from 88mm guns. Even the suspension and tracks were armored. At 27 tons, the tank was powerful enough, though speed was only 15 miles per hour. A 2-pounder gun occupied a hydraulically powered turret. The 4-man crew consisted of commander, gunner, loader, and driver. When more modern tanks appeared in Europe, Matildas were sent to the Far East, where they proved invaluable with the 3rd Australian Corps, particularly in repelling Japanese forces from Borneo. The Japanese lacked tanks or anti-tank guns capable of knocking out a Matilda. Australians used these tanks to destroy machine gun nests that inflicted heavy casualties on infantry. In Borneo's jungles, the Matilda's modest speed wasn't a disadvantage. Infantry considered its heavy armor reliable cover. But what happened when these early war tanks faced the reality of modern mechanized warfare in Europe? The limitations became brutally apparent. If you're still watching and finding this deep dive into armored warfare informative, please drop a comment below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I recommend hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Your support directly helps us continue creating detailed historical content like this. Some Matildas were converted by Australians into flame-throwing tanks, with flamethrowers replacing the main gun. These proved particularly effective against Japanese bunkers. Another Matilda variant became the Scorpion, designed by a South African engineer. It featured a rotating drum mounted on 2 guide arms at the tank's front, powered by a separate motor. The drum spun at a high speed with chains attached that struck the ground, detonating buried mines. This created safe passages through minefields, significantly accelerating mine clearing compared to traditional sappers. In the war's early phase, the Matilda performed adequately, but by 1941, enemy tanks already surpassed it. A new infantry support tank appeared, the 39-ton Churchill. Produced in large quantities with armor reaching 100 millimeters thickness, it could withstand fire from German tanks and anti-tank guns. At El Alamein in 1942, one Churchill took 31 hits and survived. Its 5-man crew operated a 12-cylinder gasoline engine providing 17 miles per hour despite considerable weight. The long base with 11 road wheels ensured excellent ground contact, even on steep slopes. Like earlier Matildas, early Churchill models mounted 2-pounder guns in the turret, but also featured a 75mm howitzer installed in the hull's front section. The 2-pounder's disadvantage was its ability to fire only armor-piercing rounds. The howitzer, however, could fire high-explosive shells against enemy anti-tank positions and machine gun nests. This made the Churchill excellent for infantry support, though before the howitzer could fire, the entire tank had to rotate toward the target for aiming, an awkward tactical limitation. Later, Churchill modifications featured different turrets equipped with 6-pounder guns, with the howitzer replaced by a machine gun. Another bow machine gun was positioned in the turret. Subsequently, Churchills mounted American 75mm guns and 95mm howitzers, firing high-explosive rounds weighing roughly 24 pounds. The Churchill first appeared on the battlefield in August 1942 during the Dieppe raid with the Canadian Calgary Regiment. The raid was prepared in secrecy on the Isle of Wight, with Churchills equipped with special equipment for water crossings, including intake and exhaust tubes. Though the raid failed, it provided invaluable experience later applied in Sicily, Italy, and Normandy landings. After Dieppe, 2 Churchill brigades, the 21st and 25th, deployed to North Africa with the First Army. They performed superbly during Tunisian operations, overcoming obstacles impassable for other tanks. The 6-pounder gun came as a complete surprise to German tank crews. Despite insufficient speed, the Churchill possessed 2 vital qualities: mobility and reliable armor. Thanks to these, tank crews loved it. What innovative modifications would transform the Churchill from infantry support tank into specialized assault vehicle? One unsuccessful attempt involved using Churchills to tow sledges carrying infantry. After field trials, the idea gained no practical application. Far more successful was the Churchill Crocodile, employed by Canadians at Dieppe. Instead of the Hull machine gun, a flamethrower was installed. A armored trailer behind the tank contained 1,500 liters of fuel, providing roughly 80 one-second bursts. Using a trailer kept the tank crew safe if hit. The Crocodile proved highly effective. The flamethrower operated at ranges up to 100 meters. All late Churchill modifications were built with flamethrower installation capability. In total, 800 tanks were converted to Crocodiles. The British had discovered something crucial. A reliable chassis could be endlessly adapted. Engineers began treating the Churchill like a Swiss Army knife, creating specialized tools for every battlefield problem. If conventional tanks couldn't cross a ditch, build a bridge layer. If mines blocked the advance, mount a fascine carrier. The question wasn't whether the Churchill could do it, it was how quickly engineers could make it happen. The sledges returned later for transporting fascines, bundles of wood laid into mud to enable vehicle movement. Fascines were also carried on tank hulls and dropped into anti-tank ditches. Since this process was laborious, special vehicles overcame ditches. For example, in Major General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division. A Churchill without a turret, equipped with engineer tackle front and rear plus guides covering the tracks, would descend into a ditch and create passage for conventional Churchills following behind. Another specialized Churchill variant belonged to the Royal Engineers, with a mortar installed in the turret for destroying fortified positions. It could also carry a 9-meter bridge mounted at the front, lowered via steel cables across ditches or streams. The bridge's load capacity reached 40 tons. It could also deploy a carpet, used for overcoming obstacles. A more complex bridge-laying apparatus was also developed by engineers, designated Churchill Arc, providing a 60-ton capacity bridge measuring 14 meters, deployed via hydraulic boom. It can rightly be considered the predecessor of modern bridge layers. Besides light tanks replacing cavalry and heavy tanks supporting infantry, Britain also produced intermediate types. One was the Covenanter, developed by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway Company from 1937 to 1940 to replace the obsolete cruiser model. Cruisers were designed for the same role as naval cruisers: fast, long-range, and heavily armed but lightly armored. Cruisers were used early in France and North Africa. These tanks first employed the American Christie suspension with 4 large independent road wheels, providing smooth movement and maneuverability. The Mark IV modification added armor to the turret's sides and rear, providing overall protection of just 1 inch thickness. Armament consisted of a 2-pounder gun and bow machine gun. The 18-ton Covenanter shared much with the previous model, but differed primarily in turret shape and the driver's position, offset to the side. Armor was approximately half an inch thicker. Unfortunately, the tank had unreliable mechanics. Despite roughly 1,000 being produced, they never reached the front, remaining in rear training units, but one British cruiser tank would prove its worth in the Desert War's most critical battles. What made it different? A far more successful model was the 19-ton Crusader, developed by Nuffield to the same specifications as the Covenanter. Unfortunately, with armor just 50 millimeters thick, it remained vulnerable to German high-velocity anti-tank guns. Despite high speed, 30 miles per hour provided by an excellent 12-cylinder gasoline engine, the Crusader's armament consisted of a 6-pounder gun, 2-pounder on early modifications, plus an additional turret with a machine gun, which proved a poor idea. Removing the additional turret reduced crew from 5 to 4. Despite shortcomings, the Crusader was popular among tankers and participated in all major North African tank battles, from defensive actions in 1941 to victory over the Germans in Tunisia in 1943. The Siege of Tobruk, lasting from November 18th to December 11th, 1941, received the codename Operation Crusader in honor of the tank that earned its place in history. At the North African War's end, Crusaders were withdrawn from front-line service. Subsequently, many served as tractors for 17-pounder anti-tank guns in Normandy or were converted into anti-aircraft platforms. One problem with coordinating arms on the battlefield, tanks, infantry, and artillery, was that artillery couldn't keep pace with tank units. Therefore, the Allies developed self-propelled artillery on tank chassis. One of the most successful was the British Sexton, armed with a 25-pounder gun on the Canadian Ram tank chassis. The 6-man crew operated in an open fighting compartment. Ammunition storage totaled 180 rounds. Frontal armor thickness reached 100 millimeters. The vehicle possessed relatively high speed, 25 miles per hour. The American M7 self-propelled gun was very similar. In British units, it received the nickname Priest because of the pulpit-like machine gun mount. The Priest mounted a 105mm howitzer in an open fighting compartment on M3 or M4 medium tank chassis. Armor thickness and other characteristics matched the Sexton, though ammunition storage was smaller at 69 rounds. Both vehicles provided the fire support so desperately needed at the front lines. Another tank whose chassis was subsequently actively used for self-propelled artillery production was the Valentine. It received this name because the project was first proposed to the War Office on the eve of St. Valentine's Day, February 10, 1938. Vickers was confident they could create a medium tank superior to the Matilda, whose production relied on government subsidy. Armor thickness should reach 50 to 60 millimeters, but tank weight shouldn't exceed 16 tons. The task proved difficult and led to several limitations. For example, Crew size was reduced to 3. Early modifications lacked a commander's cupola providing all-around vision. Operating range without additional fuel tanks was only 60 miles. Despite all shortcomings, Valentine production began in April 1939, largely because Europe faced the threat of new war. In such circumstances, any tank was welcome. Additionally, Vickers, using assembly lines in Britain and Canada, claimed Valentine manufacturing time was 1/3 that of the Matilda. The basic design resembled Vickers' own cruiser tank. Using identical components, simplified factory equipment setup. Frontal armor was inferior to the Matilda's, but overall protection was better distributed. Maximum speed matched at 15 miles per hour. In many ways, the Valentine's simpler design made it a more reliable tank. The crew was cramped inside, steering was awkward, but despite this, crews loved Valentines. Early modifications mounted 2-pounder guns, but subsequently the turret was redesigned for 6-pounder and 75mm guns, with crew increased to 4. At least 11 Valentine modifications were produced before production ceased in 1944. 4,000 were sent to the Soviet Union, where it was considered the best of all Allied-supplied tanks. How would these British tanks fare when American armor arrived in the desert? On the Valentine chassis, the Bishop self-propelled gun was produced, a predecessor to the Sexton and Priest. The project was largely improvised. The turret replaced by a primitive steel box housing a 25-pounder field gun. Elevation was limited, so maximum range reached only 3.4 miles, roughly half this gun's standard range. The crew operated in extremely cramped conditions. Despite shortcomings, the Bishop performed well in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy's opening campaign before being replaced by more successful self-propelled guns. A better successor, thoroughly engineered from the start, was the American M10 tank destroyer. In December 1941, Americans realized the Army needed a fast, well-armed tank destroyer that would engage enemy tanks, enabling their own tanks and infantry to execute breakthroughs. The result was the M10, designated Wolverine in British service. On the low M4 chassis sat a lightly armored hull with an open-topped turret mounting a 75mm gun. The British replaced it with an 18-pounder anti-tank gun far better suited for engaging tanks. The 29-ton M10 reached 30 miles per hour with a 5-man crew. On the battlefield, camouflage mattered greatly. Infantry used appropriate uniforms to conceal silhouettes. Combat vehicles were much larger and harder to hide, but typically branches, foliage, and netting sufficed to prevent enemy detection before the first shot. Mobility was equally important for infantry to keep pace with tanks. The American Army built the M3 half-track armored personnel carrier, which remained in service with various armies for 50 years after the war. Operating alongside armored cars and tanks, the M3 performed well crossing rough terrain. The M3 designation was also assigned to the light tank General Stuart, which first appeared with the British Army in North Africa in 1941, before the United States itself entered the war. This was America's answer to the Crusader. Easily handled, fast, relatively well-armored and armed. The high silhouette, resulting from the radial air-cooled engine and suspension, was certainly a disadvantage. The M3 was surprisingly maneuverable with 37-mile-per-hour speed. It charged into battle like cavalrymen of past years, firing point-blank at the enemy. Sometimes such actions forced Afrika Korps units to retreat without engaging. Like most tanks of that period, the Stuart was produced in several modifications, gasoline and diesel engines, plus cast, welded, or riveted hulls. Various machine gun types and radios were installed, but in all cases, the Stuart remained a 14-ton tank with a 4-man crew, 37mm gun, 50mm armor, and powered turret traverse. Crews appreciated constant fresh air flow thanks to ventilation grills in the hull's front section, invaluable in North Africa and Guadalcanal's swampy jungles, where M3s played a decisive role defeating Japanese forces that couldn't counter this machine. In such conditions, the relatively high ground clearance became an asset. After France fell in 1940, American specialists recognized the value of the 75mm gun mounted on the German Panzer IV. Chrysler received government authorization to create a new arsenal in Detroit for building the next generation of American tanks. First came the M3, developing the pre-war M2, which received a 37mm gun in a small turret. Additionally, a 75mm gun was installed World War I style, in a side sponson on the hull's right side. Americans considered the M3 an interim design to be replaced by the M4, armed with a 75mm gun in a rotating turret. Nevertheless, the M3 served the British excellently. Their only request to the manufacturer was modifying the turret shape to accommodate standard radio equipment. Designated Grant, the tank entered British Army service. The original American variant received the name Lee. General Bernard Law Montgomery, appointed commander of the British 8th Army in Egypt, was impressed with the new tank, as were crews of the 2nd, 4th and 22nd Armored Brigades. At 27 tons with 50mm armor, unfortunately the Grant was a massive tank, over 10 feet tall. This wasn't ideal, but it provided the commander excellent observation. Though the M3 resembled the early Churchill concept with a 75mm hull gun, it featured a radial air-cooled gasoline engine providing much higher speed, roughly 25 miles per hour. The 6-man crew operated both guns. Inside the spacious tank, sufficient room remained for 41 rounds of 75mm ammunition, which could penetrate any German tank then in service at 1,500 feet range. The sole disadvantage was limited gun traverse and inability to fire when the tank was hull down. The gun could fire high explosive shells, and with the first M4 Shermans arriving, M3s continued operating very successfully. What would happen when the Sherman, destined to become the war's most produced Allied tank, entered combat? By mid-1942, everything was about to change. American factories were churning out tanks at a rate Germany couldn't hope to match. British crews had learned brutal lessons in the desert and were hungry for payback. And the Germans, despite their technical superiority, were about to discover that in modern war, quantity has a quality all its own. The Sherman, replacing the M3 Lee and Grant, was produced in greater quantities and variants than any other Allied tank. Shermans shared the same lower hull, engine and suspension as the M3. Some later modifications lengthened the hull for larger engines and featured horizontal suspension with wide tracks for better mobility. The turret on all modifications was cast. Hulls were mostly welded, though some had cast or bolted front sections. Early modifications mounted a 75mm gun stabilized by gyroscope. It could fire while moving. Later, this was replaced by a 76mm high-velocity gun. Armament also included 2 machine guns, bow and hull-mounted. The tank first appeared on the battlefield with the British 8th Army in the desert and the U.S. Army's 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions in Tunisia in late 1942. Shermans were also used in Far Eastern jungles and Pacific islands. Here, terrain prevented using tanks in large numbers. They operated individually or in small groups supporting infantry, firing high explosive rounds to blast Japanese troops from bunkers. The Japanese had few tanks, and they were far inferior. In this theater, tanks didn't become the decisive weapon. Most Shermans received armor plates welded onto auxiliary fuel tanks. Sometimes concrete blocks were attached to hull sides. Subsequently, to avoid fires, ammunition was stored beneath the turret in special racks filled with water. Unfortunately, fires were the main shortcoming of early Sherman modifications. British crews first receiving these machines in 1942 nicknamed them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter. Grim army humor indeed. The wet ammunition storage was a direct response to crews burning alive in tanks that ignited too easily. It wasn't perfect, but it saved lives. The Sherman encountered completely different climate and terrain in Italy, where these tanks met fierce resistance. On Hitler's orders, some of the best tank units from the Eastern Front were transferred here to repel the Allied invasion. Shermans had to engage the German medium tank Panther. The Panther's advantages were terrifying. Sloped armor 75 millimeters thick versus the Sherman's 50 millimeters. Plus a high-velocity 75 millimeter gun that could punch through Sherman armor at over half-mile range. Sherman crews had to close to half that distance just for a chance at survival. That meant driving straight at an enemy that could kill you long before you could fight back. This applied even to the new 76 millimeter gun appearing on Shermans in early 1944. Ammunition load ranged from 75 to 97 rounds. Manually loading ammunition into the tank through the turret hatch was exhausting work. Machine gun ammunition totaled 5,000 rounds. One major problem in Italy was mines. Germans created several parallel fortified defensive lines across the peninsula. Insufficient mine flail-equipped tanks meant infantry had to clear paths using mine detectors. A tank's belly is its most vulnerable spot. The Sherman's belly armor was barely half an inch thick. Many fell victim to German mines. In towns and villages, numerous hazards lurked, and infantrymen were glad to have tank escorts. No one knew which house concealed snipers or machine gunners. Numerous rivers and streams also presented problems. Unmodified Shermans could ford just over 3 feet of water, so special equipment was manufactured for removing water from engines, plus exhaust pipes. With this equipment, Shermans could cross rivers nearly 6 feet deep. This modification proved useful during amphibious landings when ships couldn't approach shore closely. A modification appeared transforming Shermans into amphibians. They moved through water via 2 propellers located at the hull's rear lower section. The hull above the tracks was enclosed in rubberized fabric. It was rubberized, containing 36 rubber tubes inflated with compressed air from cylinders, holding the covering in vertical position. Steel braces provided structural rigidity. Complete assembly took 15 minutes. The original design belonged to a Hungarian engineer and was first applied to Valentine tanks. But the primary Allied amphibious tank became this Sherman. They not only successfully participated in D-Day landings, but also forged the Rhine in March 1945. In water, propellers provided 5-knot speed. Ashore, the entire structure instantly disassembled, and the tank was combat-ready again. America and Britain weren't alone in using Shermans. 2 Canadian variants existed, Ram and Grizzly. They formed the main striking force of General Leclerc's Free French 2nd Armored Division during the Normandy landing. Painted with French flag colors and the Lorraine Cross, they were first to enter Paris on August 25, 1944. But before that came much more time, with narrow roads jammed with Allied tanks and infantry units. As in Africa, tanks were festooned with spare road wheels, track links, and other equipment. Though the 76 millimeter gun was better than the 75 millimeter, the most powerful Sherman resulted from British modification, the Firefly. The 17-pounder gun, caliber 76.2 millimeters, fired armor-piercing rounds at a high velocity, enabling Shermans to fight Panthers on equal terms. Another variant was the Dozer Sherman with blade, clearing roads and filling craters under enemy fire. It first appeared at Anzio in April 1944. Eventually, 2,000 of 45,000 built Shermans were equipped with blades, which also provided additional protection from enemy fire. The main problem Allied tanks faced was the bocage, hedgerows roughly 5 feet thick. Sergeant Coolin of the 102nd Cavalry Squadron earned the Legion of Honor for inventing prongs welded to tanks for breaching hedgerows. Shermans equipped with this device were called rhinos. How did crews adapt these workhorses for winter warfare and specialized assault roles? Most Allied tanks in Europe wore traditional olive drab, but when winter arrived, they stood out against the landscape. Crews covered them with whitewash for snow camouflage. This was just one of many tricks helping survival. For example, spare track links were laid across the front hull for additional protection. Many Shermans were equipped with mine flails originally applied to Matildas, nicknamed crabs for some reason. The flail was wider than the tank, so other vehicles could safely follow in its track. Shermans mounted flamethrowers. Their use demonstrated this wasn't the best method for dealing with fortified positions that armor-piercing rounds couldn't crack. The standard B4 flamethrower, simply installed instead of the machine gun. Usually bursts lasted 2 to 3 seconds, but for suppressing particularly stubborn fortifications, bursts could last up to 25 seconds. The mixture used was napalm or ordinary gasoline. Flow was regulated by a valve. U.S. Marine Corps Shermans in the Pacific used a different flamethrower type mounted on the turret. Another Sherman variant was the Calliope, firing up to 60 rockets from launch tubes mounted above the turret. Advancing through Europe continued as Germans offered desperate resistance. Shermans constantly engaged Panthers, battles that could only be won by closing range as quickly as possible. This was difficult since Panther speed reached nearly 37 miles per hour, while Sherman managed only 25. In early 1945, the Sherman received help, the 42-ton M26 Pershing. This heavy tank mounted a 90mm gun delivering powerful strikes against the enemy. As Allies approached the Ruhr industrial region, advancing into Germany wasn't easy. Every city defended to the last. Allies often fell into organized ambushes and were forced to stick to roads and bridges. Shermans were pressed into completely unfamiliar tasks. Everyone was racing for Berlin, but it fell to Soviet forces. By agreement, the Allies stopped at the Elbe. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. A week later, Germany signed unconditional surrender. War against Japan continued until August 5th. Meanwhile, liberation parades passed through Europe, rightfully including the Sherman. At the war's start, the Soviet army fielded numerous different tanks, light, medium, and heavy. However, they soon recognized standardization advantages. A typical light tank was the T-26, produced in standard variants armed with 37mm or 45mm guns and machine guns, plus flamethrower versions. Another light tank used primarily for reconnaissance was the 5-ton T-60, armed with a 20mm gun. Despite high speed, by 1941 it was already obsolete. The main Soviet tank of World War II became the T-34, possibly the most successful machine of all time, exerting the greatest influence on subsequent tank development. Though subsequently surpassed by the German medium tank Panther, which was developed under the influence of the light tank BT, which in turn was produced based on the American Christie design. The first T-34 appeared in 1936. But it proved a complete surprise to Germans invading the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. Its fundamental characteristics were visible to the naked eye. Sloped armor plates deflecting enemy shells, large wheels and wide tracks ensuring excellent cross-country mobility, including through snow, plus a powerful 75mm gun, surpassing everything then in German and Allied service. A specially designed diesel engine, calculated for extreme temperature ranges, provided the 27-ton T-34 with 34 miles per hour speed. The T-34 was surprisingly versatile. Self-propelled guns were mounted on its chassis, particularly the Su-85, equipped with an 85mm gun developed for infantry support. Later, T-34s received new turrets housing 85mm guns, while Su-85s mounted 100mm guns. Soviet infantry mostly moved on foot. With insufficient armored personnel carriers, infantrymen rode into battle on T-34s. By Western standards, the T-34 was primitive and didn't provide crews with proper comfort. When Germans approached Moscow, tanks went straight from factories into battle. There wasn't even time for thorough painting. Initially, only a small portion had radios. Crews signaled each other with flags. But all these shortcomings were negated by the tank's amazing reliability. Sloped armor compensated for its modest thickness, up to 50mm. The diesel engine reduced fire probability when hit, already obsolete. The main Soviet tank of World War II became the T-34, possibly the most successful machine of all time, exerting the greatest influence on subsequent tank development. Though subsequently surpassed by the German medium tank Panther, which was developed under the influence of the light tank BT, which in turn was produced based on the American Christie design. The first T-34 appeared in 1936. But it proved a complete surprise to Germans invading the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Its fundamental characteristics were visible to the naked eye. Sloped armor plates deflecting enemy shells, large wheels and wide tracks, ensuring excellent cross-country mobility, including through snow, plus a powerful 75mm gun, surpassing everything then in German and Allied service. A specially designed diesel engine, calculated for extreme temperature ranges, provided the 27-ton T-34 with 34-mile-per-hour speed. The T-34 was surprisingly versatile. Self-propelled guns were mounted on its chassis, particularly the Su-85, equipped with an 85mm gun developed for infantry support. Later, T-34s received new turrets housing 85mm guns, while Su-85s mounted 100mm guns. Soviet infantry mostly moved on foot. With insufficient armored personnel carriers, infantrymen rode into battle on T-34s. By Western standards, the T-34 was primitive and didn't provide crews with proper comfort. When Germans approached Moscow, tanks went straight from factories into battle. There wasn't even time for thorough painting. Initially, only a small portion had radios. Crews signaled each other with flags. But all these shortcomings were negated by the tank's amazing reliability. Sloped armor compensated for its modest thickness. Up to 50mm, the diesel engine reduced fire probability when hit. By war's end, the T-34 had proven its worth not through comfort or sophistication, but through the brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare. It could be built faster than it could be destroyed. While German engineers obsessed over technical perfection, Soviet factories embraced pragmatic mass production. The T-34 wasn't the best tank of the war. It was the right tank for the war the Soviets had to fight. But by war's end, both the T-34 and Sherman had proven their worth not through technological superiority alone, but through the tactical flexibility and industrial capacity of their respective nations. The armored vehicles of World War II represented far more than steel and engines. They embodied the clash between industrial capacity and tactical innovation, between protecting your crew and destroying the enemy, between mobility and firepower. From the lumbering Matildas of the desert to the versatile Shermans that rolled into Berlin's outskirts, from Britain's specialized Churchill variants to the Soviet T-34 that redefined armored warfare, each machine told a story of adaptation under fire. The tanks that succeeded weren't always the most heavily armored or powerfully armed. They were the ones that could be produced in numbers, maintained under brutal conditions, and adapted to missions their designers never imagined. The Bren Carrier that started as a machine gun platform became a flamethrower. The Churchill that couldn't keep up with Crusaders became a specialized assault vehicle. The Sherman that burned too easily became the tank that won the war through sheer numbers and logistics. By 1945, armored warfare had transformed from the tentative experiments of 1939 into the dominant force on modern battlefields. The lessons learned, the importance of combined arms, the value of reliability over complexity, the need for specialized vehicles alongside main battle tanks, would shape military doctrine for decades to come. These machines and their crews didn't just fight World War II. They revolutionized how wars would be fought forever after. The crews who climbed into these steel boxes, many of them teenagers who'd never seen combat, learned to navigate, shoot, and survive while trapped inside. They fought buttoned up in darkness, relying on periscopes and radio, trusting their lives to welded armor and the training they'd received weeks earlier. They deserve to be remembered as much as the machines they operated. Thank you for joining us today on this journey through armored warfare history. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share one thing you already knew about these incredible machines, or something that surprised you. Your thoughts and insights are genuinely important to us, and they help shape future content. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we'll explore another fascinating chapter of history.